Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of ESA's Women, I welcome you all to today's session of An Author's Afternoon here at Taj Bengal. This is an initiative of Prabha Khaitan Foundation. An Author's Afternoon is a successful series of enchanting afternoons which are dedicated to authors, particularly Indian authors who write in English. Prabha Khaitan Foundation was established 40 years ago, and they work in many areas for the promotion of Indian art, Indian culture, literature, music, education, and they also have a lot of child and women welfare programs. Prabha Khaitan Foundation has its presence in 40 cities, which include several cities across the country and a few cities abroad. The foundation's anthem, which you just heard, embodies the true spirit of Indian philosophy, unity in diversity. That is why Rabindranath Tagore's music blends into the music of the Langa and Manganiyar musicians of Rajasthan, and Dadra fuses with Kajri. True to the spirit of the foundation, whenever we have important guests or when we have our patrons visiting, we always gift them with products that are made by Indian artisans. The foundation creates an awareness in the community by upholding one pressing social issue every month. And this is called the Cause of the Month. And this month, December, the cause is human rights, and you would have seen it in the artwork of Shudipta Kundu in the invitation. Today we have with us Mr. Anshul Chaturvedi. Mr. Chaturvedi has always been fascinated with the Second World War, and some of his earliest memories are watching the Battle of the Bulge in primary school and then scattering toy soldiers of the British and German armies across his room. Another subject of interest for him right from his teenage years has been Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose is undoubtedly one of the greatest leaders of Indian nationalism and the Indian freedom movement. His defiant patriotism and his fight against the British imperialism, fought from both within and outside the country, makes him one of the greatest heroes of our times. Mr. Chaturvedi has written about his political legacy and how he was influenced by the ideals of Swami Vivekananda early in life, and later when he came to Kolkata to study at Presidency College, how he was also influenced by Rishi Aurobindo. And it is perhaps inevitable that these two fascinations would converge in the shape of the novel that he will be discussing today. In conversation with him is Mrs. Esha Datto. Esha is an ESA's woman of Kolkata. I think one of the first ESA's women of Kolkata. And in today's session, we are maintaining all COVID protocols. All of you have your masks on. We have kept the middle seats empty, and I'm sure we're going to have a great session now. Thank you. Over to you, Aisha.
Welcome to yet another session of an author's afternoon. It's always a pleasure to be hosting this, and I'm very glad the physical sessions are back on. We've had 2 years of online sessions. Welcome to the city, Anshul, and a very important city for the subjects that we are going to be discussing, because like I was telling you earlier, both your protagonists or both your novels, the earlier one, Vivekananda as well as Netaji, both whom we consider very close to our hearts, right here in Bengal. And I have to say he did admit a bit of no, I was trying to put it very politely, but he said it.
Bangla speaker, I don't know these two, and coming to Kolkata, I mean, it takes courage, I think.
No, you don't. And I was trying to placate him by saying, don't worry, we're a very, very mild audience. You won't have any problems. You won't have any controversial questions. So please don't let me down there. Okay, so the book is titled A Bird from Afar. I think I'll leave it to Anshul later to explain the title. But tell us, what was this fascination with this period of history? You have done extensive research on the Second World War, and in the book it's a historical fiction, a very unusual genre. You either have historical books or you have fiction, but you have deviated in the second half and you have turned the narrative into a what-if situation. So take us through this. What actually prompted you to write on this period and on the man, mainly the man who fascinated you for all these years?
See, the war in itself is something I think we don't fully comprehend its magnitude in India. And I think, we talk about the war as if we were an incidental part of it, without probably understanding that we came very close to being a central part of the war. In 1942, George Orwell was working for the BBC, and he said in a radio statement, if Singapore falls, India becomes the center of the war, that is to say, the center of the world. In 1942, Hitler is discussing, Wavell is discussing, the Japanese discussing the potentiality of a German-Japanese meetup, which obviously has to go through India and has to assume that the Indian population would be inclined to support such an activity. At the same time, you've had an atmosphere where Gandhi has said, we do not seek our independence out of Britain's ruin. We have Nehru saying it would be against India's honor to take advantage of Britain at such a situation. We have Subhash, who's described very, very quickly by the Daily Mail as India's quisling #1, flees to Hitler. And when you read about the war in itself, even if you do not, I came to Subhash later, but when I read about the war even earlier, it's, we look at it as if, okay, our soldiers fought in Europe, our soldiers fought in Italy, and we have memorials for them. And I often wondered that the nuances of the war tend to get lost because, say, even if you take Kohima, even if you take the INA, sometimes you see the regiments which fought for the British, and you see memorials to them, and you say, oh, they were heroes. But the men of the INA who fought against them, we say, oh, they were heroes. And I'm a little confused, like, how can a country go back and say people on both sides were heroes for the same cause? We have to sit back and think, okay, what was our role in the war? And why were our men so... And we keep thinking about, just they defended the British territory here. But Indian soldiers, essentially, from here till Egypt, all of this territory was British because Indian soldiers lined up to go and fight against the Axis for this. And when in 1942 Quit India failed, Churchill said in the House of Commons that the primary reason why he is not worried about what the Congress is doing is because the martial races of India have no connect with the Congress. And so long as they are with the British, their rule here is assured. And much later when I read about Subhash in more detail and his experiments, which tend to be, we tend to sort of look at the INA and stop there. But to my mind, the INA was Subhash taking over as new management of existing entity. Whereas Subhash's own army, the first one he built, was in Germany. And the whole point at that point, no, it's a small thing, okay, so 1,000 men, this many men. The point is that the foundation of British rule and the reason why the British were very confident, no matter what happens in terms of civil uprisings, that the military system of the country would stay with them. Subhash is the first man who managed to convert the soldier and say, maybe you should not be with the British, because I don't see any other example. Before Subhash began recruiting, for anybody changing his oath of allegiance to the crown. That Gandhi could not do. And nobody could do. So there, I think his blend of being a trans-India personality as well. Because even, I mean, we made a small point about, would partition have actually happened had Subhash been around. Now, we all know that the British policy of recruiting was along martial and ethnic and caste lines. But however it was structured, in that period, the British Army was about 45% Muslim and Sikh, if I'm not wrong, approximately. So that's the pool Subhash will have to hire from, right? If he's seen globally as either a Hindu leader or a Bangla leader, he cannot get the Baloch to come and fight with him. But he did manage that. And again, for that, I saw no parallel. So when I began to read about, because see, to many of us, Subhash is, and I especially say, when I go to Dalhousie and I see a big Subhash painting there, or I go to some school in Delhi and there is this, sometimes the vision I get is, we talk about Subhash, at least outside of Bengal, as if Subhash was born wearing jackboots. And that's how he lived all his life, and that's all you remember him by. But the war is what? 2 years of a 48-year-old life. So say a couple of days back, I saw he had tweeted, that maybe the mayor of Kolkata can remember that Subhash was the mayor here, and people don't remember him as that. Yeah. It's just Aine. But the Aine is 1944, boss. 45 a crash happened. I don't know what happened after that. But that's the phase. So there is so much more. And the exercise of building that army is not about how much land you gained. It's about the fact that for the first time since the 1860s, you built an army which had Indian soldiers who were not assigned according to ethnicity. That, I think, there are things he did in the middle of that war which had a ramification beyond things. And tomorrow we say, okay, the Navy mutiny subsequently and other things reflected that the armed forces were no longer blindly loyal to the British, etc., etc. So that's the larger picture. The war could have gone in so many ways, that what Subhash was planning to do could have gone in so many ways. And that's from where these two things converged. And when the book came out that day, I put out a small note. I have saved it after that. I'd like to read that out. Subhash boasts many things to many people and attracts a range of extreme emotions. But to me, he is, in a distant way, of course, someone I empathize with, I'm almost fond of. I cannot find one easy and conflict-free phase of his life. I cannot find any easy, obvious, or universally acceptable choices coming his way. And I admire the manner in which he faced this endless series of conflicts and dilemmas life sent his way, without at any point being a man of compromise or adjustment. I admire even more how, instead of being nothing more than a man of steel forged by all these fires, he retained and sustained his sensitivity, his concern, his inclusiveness, his objectivity. Like so many others, I too have at some point smiled over some or the other if this had been an aspect of his life. Yun hota to kya hota? Given that I've also been an obsessive consumer of World War II, even as I read about Subhash parallelly, the mind wove its own stories, its own conjectures, its responses to what would Subhash have done if... At some points, I searched for some stories to read. Stories such as Robert Harris's fabulous Fatherland in the Indian context, a space to reimagine and reconstruct. I could not find much, perhaps because there is in any case so much mystery, intrigue and speculation about the details of his real life. And then, as it happened earlier in the case of the Vivekananda Handbook, I ended up writing the book I wanted to read. There is also a commonality that has bound me to Subhash over the distance of these years. He wrote, quote, I was barely 15 when Vivekananda entered my life. Then there followed a revolution within and everything was turned upside down, unquote. I was 17, not 15, but this thought and the details thereafter resonated intensely with me. So here this is a story of World War II going differently at critical points in 1942, and Subhash and his legion raised in Germany, exploring if that wasn't an opportunity to chalo Delhi from the west, not from the east. Fiction is hardly my forte, and the time to debut here is hardly the 40s, but I hope you will still read it. With much trepidation, I requested Mihir Bose, who wrote a very good biography of Subhash, The Lost Hero, to read and hopefully say a couple of non-critical lines about the book in advance. He sent back a note that ended with this, quote, "The author combines the sure grasp of history with an ability to convert little-known facts into a marvelous fictional page-turner, establishing himself as a Robert Harris of India," unquote. And I felt I could now happily retire from fiction writing.
So that's exactly what you say. There must have been an ethical conflict in Subhash's mind when he had to. You start the book in once he's gone to Germany, when he's set up office in Berlin, and so for him, he was not a man who was pro-violence by any means. Just because he opposed Gandhi doesn't mean he was pro-violence. He had to set up the army because he thought that was the best way to get freedom, get his freedom, and for him, the ends justified the means. So tell us something about this association with, like, he's been called a Nazi, a collaborator with Hitler, and a lot of those things. But like I said, he was never pro-violence. So why don't you tell us something about that?
So I have put two quotes as the book starts to give the context to how the story goes. The first one is what Subhash wrote in the Indian struggle. The immediate objective of the forward bloc was an uncompromising struggle with British imperialism for winning India's independence. To this end, all possible means should be employed, and the Indian people should not be hampered by A, any philosophical notions like Gandhi's non-violence, B, or any sentimentalism like Nehru's anti-Axis foreign policy. This is where Subhash, how do I say, he draws that line. His objective is to use all possible means. Now, his peers in the Congress had a caveat that we would want independence, of course, but not this way and not this way. And Subhash's perspective, and one point I've noted here, I mean, since you've read the book, you would have seen that in that note he writes to Sharath. It's, of course, composed by me. But the point I'm making is that nobody had as clear a view of European politics and global politics as he had. And so his mind was extremely clear that if this opportunity is let go, while we sit here trying to be morally superior to somebody, the point is that the uncompromising struggle will not happen. So he had a problem with compromise struggles. And that was the difference, which made him branch out on his own. And it's not something which happened in 1944, 42 or whatever. I mean, right from Chauri Chaura, he was upset that Gandhiji had called out the movement. So he was, for a very long time, wanting this to be all out. And he thought this was an opportunity to do. Now, that is sometimes seen as, oh, he went to Hitler, which meant he was a fanboy of that system. And so I have to remind people that he did not land in Berlin for the first time in 1941. He was there in the 1930s, as was Nehru, as was Mahatma Gandhi, who met Mussolini. I mean, India was fairly active in the 1930s. And what did Subhash come back in the 1930s with? That's the second quote I have put here. His well-known letter in March 1936. Today, I regret that I have to return to India with the conviction that the new nationalism in Germany is not only narrow and selfish, but arrogant. The new racial philosophy, which has a very weak scientific foundation, stands for glorification of the white races in general and the German race in particular. And this he is talking when Adolf Hitler is ruling Germany. He has written to German newspapers against Hitler's comments in public and against Hitler's writing in Mein Kampf, where he said, I would rather see India under the control of the English than anybody else. And where Hitler recurrently said, Russia will be our India. So, if you see Subhash, that's something, he was not born in the World War. If you see his mind in the run-up to this space, I cannot understand how anybody would see him as a fanboy of the German system. Having said that, where else would he go? 1 year back, I had an ill-judged moment where I got into a Twitter battle with somebody in the US talking about, somebody wearing a Netaji t-shirt and saying this guy is a fascist and so on and so forth. And my point was that, gentlemen, when Subhash Bose was looking for freedom, the US was landing troops in India, not at our invitation. So how would we come to you to seek help? You said the Atlantic Charter would not apply to us, so how would we come to you to seek help? And by the way, you were a colonial power in the Philippines during World War II, so how would we come to you for anti-imperialistic sentiments? So where would we go? Obviously not to you. Let us go somewhere. So that's the space sort of I inhabit.
So that's the key element in his personality, where he was quite fearless in that regard. He was never scared to displease or disagree with people in authority. You've seen it with Hitler, you see it with Gandhi, with Nehru.
Which I thought was very interesting, because I said this man worked closely with the century's most non-violent and most violent man.
Yes.
And became a number two devoted to neither.
Very true.
So fictionally speaking, at some point when he meets Gandhi in the book, and Gandhi, sort of says to him that you've aligned to a dictator. He said, if I had to do that, Bapu, I would have stayed in the Congress.
Yeah. So tell us something about the early influence. Like you said, he had a brush with Vivekananda at the age of 15, and that shaped his life to a large extent, his policies, his mind, his principles. And you too have written a book on Vivekananda, your earlier book, which is like a handbook, like you said. It's not an academic narrative, but more like a handbook which you can apply to your daily living. So tell us something about the influence Vivekananda had on him first, and then, of course, on you.
Let me go in reverse. Let me go in reverse and come to Vivekananda at the end, because it is, normally philosophy is not so inherent to fiction. Yeah. But if I'm writing philosophy and I'm writing a Robert Ludlum novel, I can create a protagonist and he can do whatever he wants to do. He's entirely in my space. But Subhash is such a sharply edged mind. And so for all his life, he has thought so clearly and so vividly and explained his thoughts so clearly that if I have to create a world where Subhash is taking a decision, I have to understand his moral benchmarks, his philosophy, his intellectual prowess very carefully. And that's where Vivekananda does come in recurrently, even if not upfront. But as he said, Ramakrishna Vivekananda gave him a base to build his moral and philosophical space, and a reference point for when difficult calls came his way. But before I come there, I'd like to sort of, because there will be so many small questions which perhaps may not come up in the course of the timeline that I have. So maybe I'll answer them proactively in a sense and run through the sharper points of where the book is coming from. Now, why does this army, the army he raised in Germany, be that important for me? It's because it is believed, now there's no official record of that era, but June 1942, when the Indian Legion first took its oath after passing out, Subhash is believed to have said this to them: throughout my life, it was my ambition to equip an army that will capture freedom from the enemy. Today, I congratulate you because the honor of such an army belongs to you. And then I read a lot about how he trained this army from German officers who wrote books about that brief phase. And I saw the obsessiveness of what we discussed earlier, that the deregimentation, if I may say so. And then I read a little bit on why was Subhash so focused on that model, and why did that model come into being. So if you look at that part, this gentleman called Charles Wood, he wrote things which I brought into the book for reference. So Charles Wood was the Secretary of State for India in the 1860s, just after the mutiny. I'll quote two lines from him which summarize, I think, what Subhash was facing when he began to go to soldiers and say, could you please come together in a kitchen, irrespective of ethnicity and religion, and eat together.
And these soldiers were all the prisoners of war.
Yeah, they were all people who had taken an oath to the crown to serve the crown and were prisoners. So Wood says, if one regiment mutinies, I should like to have the next so alien that it would be ready to fire into it. This is very coherent policy, frankly, because then you will never have an Indian mutiny again. And that is what Subhash is battling in the 1940s, a culture in the army from the 1860s. If one regiment mutinies, the other should be so alien that you should be ready to fire into it. Wood specified more details slightly later on. And if I remember rightly, he wrote, and Subhash is quoting him here, he wanted such a spirit, quote unquote, so that Sikh might fire into Hindu, Gorkha into either, without any scruple in case of need. And so Subhash says to the prisoners of war, is it the British who killed the people at Jallianwala Bagh? Or Is it the 9th Gorkhas, 54th Sikhs, and 59th Scindias? That the loyalty of the Indian soldier it's so unquestioningly loyal that he kills for the British. That he goes to liberate countries in Europe which have lost their liberty 2 years back, to give it back to them, but he does not bother to liberate his own country which is there, because he is trained for decades as to fire into the other community, the ethnicity. That's what. And so that this whole concept of putting Subhash into that space where he begins to convince people that there is another way to fight for this country. That narrative, and I don't think anybody else could have done that. So that makes for a complicated battle. And why does that actually become a military factor apart from numbers? So 1942, Viceroy Lindith Go writes to Winston Churchill, "Above all, we must have anxious regard for the continuing soundness of the Indian Army." And that's the point. What do you mean by that? The soundness of the Indian Army, which alone stands between the Japanese and their ultimate objective, which must be a union, military and economic, with the German army on the Persian Gulf. February 42 is when Singapore is fallen, when Burma seems likely to fall, when Rommel is entering North Africa, and by which time the Germans are still unstoppable, because Stalingrad is very, very many months away at that stage. So the soundness of the Indian army, the guaranteed loyalty to the Indian soldier, is a critical military weapon worth many divisions. And therefore my point that Subhash is the only man who had the ability, and so the version of the book was that had 42 gone the way it could have gone, what it looked mid-42, had Stalingrad gone Germany's way, and had Rommel been fortified enough by the Axis while he was rampaging through North Africa, and you draw a line from there, and militarily it still looks distant because the Caucasus is fairly far away and Egypt is fairly far away, but what's between them? It's the Middle East. It's Syria. Syria is controlled by Vichy France, which is aligned to Germany. There is Iran. There is Iraq. Iraq is entirely controlled by Indian troops, primarily. The 10th Persian Gulf Command. Iran, by the way, I don't know how many of us know of this, but Iran changed its name to from Persia to Iran, basis the word's affinity with Aryan. The German ambassador to Persia, to Tehran, and the Iranian ambassador to Germany were instrumental in making this point. And if you read the race laws, the Persians were a race counted as Aryans by the Nazi system. So it's an extremely anti-British space and handled primarily by Indian soldiers. So it's like I'm saying, it's of course today it reads fantastic, but it's actually militarily a very coherent possibility, that domain. Because Subhash is the man who could turn the Indian soldier. So if you had only Indian soldier between him and India, I do think that he would have managed to do a lot more than anybody else could have done. I could do that. So in that, you talked about the title and the letter. So here I like to read out the line from which the title came. Subhash's letter to Emily Schenkel, March 1936. I am like a wandering bird that comes from afar, remains for a while, and then flies away to its distant home. For such a person, why should you cherish so much love? And subsequently, in the same letter, he has gone on to say to her, I have already sold myself to my first love, my country. I have very little left to give to anyone. Now, if that's not romantic nationalism, what is?
Which is why you even mentioned in the book that he was so consumed with his first love, that is his motherland, that there was very little space to be a brother, a son, a partner, because that whole patriotic feeling, this need for freeing his country, to be part of that struggle, was all-consuming for him, and that was his only focus, basically.
The point being that we have reinforced that so much. And in his own life, he put everything behind, and he said, "My country comes first." But then we were so much in awe of it that we do not acknowledge that he had a life or existence beyond fighting for India.
And he left his wife and child, in fact, and when he got onto that submarine.
Yes. So with the other leaders, I had this fear when I would read about things. I would have some sense of, I mean, let's say you take something as simple as, not simple, but okay, like Gandhi.
Yeah.
So while I understand Gandhiji's economic policy, etc., but I also understand that, okay, goat's milk and not cow's milk. Experiments with truth, relationship with Kasturba, what children think of him as a father. Subhash is supposed to only march for the country. He is supposed to have no other dimension to his life. For us also, and we are very happy with that, somehow. To put him on that, and worship him every morning and not look at him as an individual who had battles. And I mean, the price he paid for what he did, I don't think is acknowledged enough.
That's true.
Because he feels there's so much of pride that no other emotion is allowed to come into it.
So, how long did it take you to write this book?
I really
Your
don't
research
know.
must have been extensive because, you've gone into a lot of detail. When you'll read the book, you'll understand what I'm saying. When did you first think? What was the nucleus? When did you first start thinking that this is the kind, like you said, it's a book I wanted to read? So when did that thought first come?
Because
And like somebody's pointed out, it was a very courageous thing to go into the mind of somebody like Subhash. So, what prompted this?
my concern was that, like I said, everybody seems to think that Subhash as a figure came into being in 1944 when he went to start the INA. And that is about it. And the other thing, if you go a little back, all that you get of him as a I'm not saying as a WhatsApp forward, but as a summation of his life. Oh, he was anti-Gandhi / anti-Nehru, and that's where you stopped him at. But if you look at the West, you look at a European or American, oh, he was pro-Hitler, and you stop at that. And I was mystified that nobody's going to read about the nuances, because he was not a man to be blocked into these pro and anti boxes as if he's a follower of one wing and an opponent of the other. But nobody is actually reading what he wrote. And he wrote extensively, but people don't read as much. So the thought being that while, of course, the potentiality of the war going differently for India is one thing, but maybe if I can bring him into it and also explain how, going by his own writings, how that adjustment with Germany was not a very easy call for him. How his dynamics with, say, even a Gandhi changed over time. I mean, 1939 or so, Gandhi is completely opposed to anything which is anti-British. In 1942, which is just 3 years later, he is saying to the British, leave India to God if you cannot leave us to anarchy. That's a very, very huge transition. Where does that come from? Some think it comes from the influence of Subhash. Because when Stafford Cripps came to India, and he met Maulana Azad, he complained loudly about how Gandhi was so vocal in his praise of Subhash Bose. And that upset a lot of people, saying, but this is not Gandhi's position. But Gandhi's position moved a little. And I'm sure those of here, everybody would know, but that false story when it was said that he had died in a plane crash before 45. And Gandhi sent a note to his mother, a long note expressing what he thought of Subhash, Prince, and so on and so forth. And many in the Congress who thought that they were sworn enemies were surprised at that tonality. So the power of his personality and his conviction would make people change their original positions. That happened with the Germans to a bit, that happened with the Italians to a bit, that happened here as well. So he's a good character to go through, because his magnetic stream changes the way things go as he steps into those areas.
So Subhash and Gandhi was still open to a little bit of change, like he could be changed in his mind space.
Yes.
But Nehru was a very different person. He was radically opposed to what Subhash's plans were, right?
So my theory is that they could never have sort of come to a middle point here. And
I have a whole passage. I know, but you marked it. I haven't.
Yeah, I marked small things, because so what Nehru wrote in 1940 was, launching a civil disobedience campaign at a time when Britain is engaged in a life and death struggle would be an act derogatory to India's honor. This is definitely not what Subhash thought. So it starts with that. Subhash writes in August 42, before Quit India, Nehru is fanatically anti-Axis, and left to himself, he will go to any lengths in order to fight the tripartite powers. Nehru writes in April 42 as clearly as is possible, Hitler and Japan must go to hell. I shall fight them to the end, and this is my policy. I shall also fight Mr. Subhash Bose and his party along with Japan if he comes to India. So even though I don't see personal animosity between those people at that stage, but their ideological lines were very clear. And the bottom line came to the point that for Subhash, terms and conditions did not apply when it came to getting India independence. For the rest, it did. And I think that's the ideological difference we should respect in hindsight, because it's a challenge which we do not know what they faced at that stage, both parties.
So what made you make this book into a historical fiction? Like in the second part, like you said, post 1942, I think, the book turns towards fiction, where you have kind of hypothetical situations. What if Stalingrad did not happen, things went the other way, Subhash had reached India? So why did you want to make it this way? Why wasn't it a purely factual book?
There is no dearth of actual homework on him.
Yes, you have made it extremely interesting because you did just that. You kind of, the fiction part of it kind of makes us think. It's thought-provoking.
No, because that part, we know that as a student,
we know what
So we are able to evaluate what he would do as, say, an intellectual or a student. We know he cleared the civil services and left it. We know as a politician, he was the mayor here. He was elected Congress president, defeating Gandhi's candidate. We know all of that. We know the rest dimensions of his life. This is an area where he's not the chance to write himself. He doesn't send me an account of how he met Hitler. He doesn't write a book about how he trained the INA. For that, you have to go to other sources. And so that narrative, that flow, is a little lost. Plus, the dilemmas of a man, and the point I'm making is that we should not paint him like this aggressive bull who charges into things and says, I will liberate my country, the rest be damned. This is a man who, like in the case of Emily 1936, is saying, look, my first life is my country. I may not stay here. Why do you care so much about me? He's not okay with theek hai, jo bhi hai. So he's a man who's pained at small things. He's a hypersensitive soul from what you read of his other writings, his philosophy, his writings on Vivekananda and Ramakrishna. So I think it's a very conflicted life that he leads, recurrently being drawn into things where there is no right answer to be taken. And it's very easy for people to sit back and say, oh, aligning with the fascists. And I said, is that easy? But in 1936, he was so anti-Führer. So how would he do this? Then within Germany, you have to understand there are so many layers of what Germany was. So
he even tried to convince Hitler to remove that portion from his book, right? Because the anti-Indians.
Who could convince Hitler to do anything?
Yeah.
If Hitler's journalists could have convinced him to do something, the war would have gone differently. So being unconvincible is not a good trait in hindsight for most people.
Okay, so should we now? He's written his earlier book is on Vivekananda. I have not personally read it, but I definitely want to. Like he said, it's not an academic exercise, but it's called the handbook, right? A handbook for everyday living, Vivekananda, which is how he can be applied in everybody's lives. And there's a very important paragraph which he puts in the book. He says, we tend to idolize all our icons, which is I think Indians as a race, we are very emotional, sentimental. So whenever, be it political, a sports person, or even a film star, I think we always very quick to put them up on a pedestal. And that is exactly what he's saying. He's saying, please tell them about that feedback you got where someone said, thank you for taking him off our wall. I thought that was lovely.
Yeah, that was Shumant Paul called me after he had the Vivekananda book. I'll come to that in a moment. But what he said was that, thank you for taking him off the calendar hanging behind me and putting him on a table next to me, because otherwise I won't turn back and look at that calendar. So I said, okay, coming from Kolkata, that's a feedback I relish. When I come there, I'll talk about it. But before I switch to the two, I'd like to sort of read out the last page of my book. Okay, yes, of course. Yeah. The author's note is... Actually, if I come half a para beforehand, then I can also blend in Vivekananda. So I'll start from here. So bear with me. This is how the book ends. This is the author's note of the book. His faith in the teachings of Swami Vivekananda and Ramakrishna Paramhans further strengthened his inclusive and harmonious view of the India to come post-independence. Not many know of how strongly Vivekananda influenced his mind from his early years. In The Indian Pilgrim, he wrote, I was barely 15 when Vivekananda entered my life. Then there followed a revolution within and everything was turned upside down. Later, these principles and a sense of nationalism came together. Quote, the foundation of the present freedom movement owes its origin to Swamiji's message. If India is to be free, it cannot be a land especially of Hinduism or of Islam. It must be one united land of different religions, communities inspired by the ideal of nationalism. And for that, Indians must accept wholeheartedly the gospel of harmony of religions, which is the gospel of Ramakrishna Vivekananda. The ideal of nationalism that he preached, imbibed, and practiced was exceptionally high. To his followers and fans, Subhash is a romantic idealist, a man who can do no wrong. To his critics, his alliance with Nazi Germany and fascist Italy is a definitive sin for which the rest of his life is not enough redemption. To me, he is someone who has single-minded purpose right from his days as a student, and he stayed with that throughout, all means justifying the end being the liberation of India. The more I read of him, the more I understood his unwillingness to take a politically correct position and watch the opportunity that World War II brought pass India by. He did not endorse much of what Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan were doing, even as he admired their military strength and the willingness to use it to change their political status. I've been intrigued at his ability to work with and yet not become subordinate to either Gandhi or Hitler, who are not only hugely different but amongst the most influential personalities on the planet. He would accept the strengths of both, but would not hesitate to vocally criticize what he disagreed with. Subhash was also a leader who genuinely believed in harmony and synthesis. Perhaps he was our best bet for bringing an undivided India out of the bitter, tense situation of the 1940s. Had things gone somewhat along the lines my imagination is drawn up here, had he been an active part of the military and political situation before the British rule ended, there's a very strong chance that the India we grew up in and the India we live in today would have been different. When it came to his motherland, he was not a man of compromise. The situations he worked in were extremely challenging, the resources limited, the battles literal life and death ones. The pressures he faced were immense and the price he paid was not small. Subhash, the leader, was so big that Subhash, the person, the son, the brother, the partner, barely had space to emerge. And yet, all his writings and thoughts indicate an extremely sensitive, evolved mind, not some power-obsessed political leader. He would have thought and thought before each step he took, weighed and measured. It would not have been easy. We aren't placed to judge him. Mihir Bose wrote in The Lost Hero about M.N. Roy meeting Subhash in 1931 for a long political discussion. Afterwards, Roy said of him to his friends, quote, "He is full of Bharat Mata, nothing else," unquote. That was Subhash, nothing else.
So now you'd like to throw some light about your earlier work, because there is relevance considering he had such a great influence on your current protagonist.
See, Vivekananda, I think, is the most talked about and the most under-followed celebrity that we have. So, I am always bemused at how much is said about him and how simply he conveys things and how little they are followed.
Very true.
So neither do we disown him nor do we follow him. He stays in the calendar. And it goes on. So I wrote this because when I would say to people, I read Vivekananda, they would say, "You're religious." I said, like, you're being called religious in a teenager is death worse. Who talks to a religious teenager? It's definitely not cool. But much later, I could explain to people that Vivekananda was the Dale Carney of my teenage and the Stephen Covey of my career. And when people would say, "Na, come to this Guruji, come to that Guruji," I said, "Boss, I have a benchmark. तुम्हारे Guruji उससे आते नहीं है, तो I'll just be disappointed. It's not going to work." And the clarity of his thought, in terms of when he said religion, his criteria for saying, "Can you teach me religion?" is to ask somebody, "Have you seen God?" And when he gets a yes, then he tests the man for 6 years. And today, I mean, with no offense, I won't take any names, but it seems very easy to become a religious leader. And I've heard some of them and say, "Yeah, itna to lecture मैं भी दे सकता हूँ." So, should I grow a long beard? Will it work as a career option? Because nobody asks the question which these people ask. So, I just have been very, very bemused, and so I wrote this to explain to people in a certain way that the mistake I think we make, this is a very personal view here, is that we attribute so much of collective strength to Vivekananda. Like, he's our national icon, 130 million people, He went and preached about us. So he's become again this symbol of national collective strength. Whereas I need individual strength from religion. The nation being strong does not make me less scared of my own death. If somebody died of COVID in Delhi, their children were not thinking the nation's economy is growing. They think my father has died. A religion which cannot make me individually stronger. I don't care what, because collective strength of nations, I'm sorry, but I just, when I read this book, Hitler was giving a lot of collective strength to the Germans. Still the Russians began to come into Berlin. So it doesn't always work. Collective strength of any. So it's a thought which comes to me. It's like, there's Rommel in the book, right? And Rommel writes to his wife, saying that I just hope that we don't fall into this trap of, falling into our past greatness, because in this war, we demolished the Greeks in 1 week. And the Italians are our subordinates. And the pyramids watch as I drive through Egypt. So the past, military cycles and economic cycles go up and down. That collective strength is a... So where I am searching for in religion is if you've seen Gravity, the George Clooney moment, if I cut off and I drift, at that time I don't even know cremation hoga, burial hoga, kya hoga, kuch bhi nahi hoga. Then what is God to me at that moment? Can I die peacefully? Do I know what it is all about? That space, I think, Vivekananda actually has the ability to fill. And so I think we undervalue him by putting him into this collective statue calendar thing. It should be a more one-to-one relationship we have with the man, like he had with Ramakrishna. And people sometimes talk about structure, politics, government, and I say, listen, when Ramakrishna Paramahansa said that Mahakali came and spoke to me at Dakshineshwar, did she take the permission of the Viceroy? I don't think she needs political power structures to be relevant. When Kheer Bhavani came to Vivekananda and scolded him in the temple, did she ask the Maharaja of Kashmir for sanction to speak to him? So, administration structures, after 50 years, we are all dead. That is not the point of religion. The point of religion is, how do I handle the grey that I see post the other side? What happens? How does it happen? And so this person, he brought such clarity. Today, she'll know it's not easy to get me to shut up when I start talking. But it starts with the point where in school you could not get me onto stage. And my teacher said, "Arey beta, your English is go on the stage." I can't go on the stage. I'm petrified. I'm petrified of 100 things as a teenager. And then I see this man writing. And he begins to make sense to me. And then, so when I read Subhash said that, after I began to read him, I began to become a rebel, and my parents were worried what is happening to this boy. I get a deja vu there. I get the sense of what happens. Parents saying, what is happening? Ye kya ho raha hai? You used to be a good boy. I said, those days are gone now. But then the point was that rebellion does not die, even when your hairline begins to recede. Otherwise it does. So in that space, Vivekananda for me, and the book I divide into 3 parts basically. I'd maybe skim through a few portions to explain what are the highlights of what he said. But if I don't have money and I'm perturbed at that, then he's my solution. If I lose somebody, he is my solution. If I get a bad appraisal, he is my solution. He is not my collective national catharsis. He is my individual guide. And the problem with having that guide, even if in the Eklavya mode, is that all other guides seem so like wannabes. I'm sorry, but they just don't match up in the clarity of thoughts. That's where he is for me. And so when, in that sense, when Vivekananda says, if name and fame and money go, let them go. They're a terrible burden. And so even in that book I said one place I saw this. Because it takes guts to say, let the Indian civil service go. Yeah, really. It takes guts to say, let the Congress go. I will let go rather than hang on to these things. And what I call the Bandar ki muthi test. That, you are unwilling to let go, so you keep getting stuck. And Subhash would let go. And each time his CV would be bigger than the previous CV. So perhaps it is his own personality, but perhaps it is a small indoctrination of what as a youngster. And one thing again, which I related to in a personal capacity, because Subhash in his college days, and you would much more detail than I would do also, but he left home. He went off and he experimented, and he went to Haridwar, he went to Kashi, he spoke to people who were religious people, and he was very religion centered in his younger days. And he came back and he said, I didn't find my answers with these people. They really weren't quite there. And I would have these debates and discussions, beta, some Swamiji has come and Swamiji would say, beta, okay, do this, and you will have a long and a healthy life and so on and so forth. और भगवान आपका ध्यान रखेंगे, आप काफ़ी उम्र तक जियोगे. तो मैंने पूछा था, स्वामी जी उस उम्र के आगे चला जाऊंगा तब भगवान ध्यान रखना बंद कर देंगे क्या? बिकॉज एक्सपायरी तो आ जाती है. इससे ऐसी कैसी बातें कर रहे हो? मैंने कहा आप हाउ लॉन्ग विल यू लिव? 120. So I said, if not, so if the presence of my physical health and my life is the grace of God, then my death is God taking away His grace. That means all my ancestors lost grace by the time they crossed a certain age. So I'm saying, why is God's affection coming with the expiry date? Doesn't make sense to me. So this cannot be the criteria. I mean, there are whales which live for 100 years, there are trees which live for 300 years, so ergo by that logic, the grace is higher on that side. And I said the Buddha's question was that, these things are inevitable, right? Old age, death, sickness. So this is inevitable. And then I said, if the point of this is God's grace keeps you healthy and fit, then why does Vivekananda die at 39 and why does Ramakrishna die of throat cancer? I don't see youth and fitness here. And then why does Ramakrishna say to Vivekananda that you have cured others, why don't you cure yourself? And he says, what? Bring down her mercy for this body which has to go anyway. So the manner he brought to life and death questions was very different from the Sukh Sampatti Gharaave Kasht Mite Tan Ka. That's not what he is saying. कि सुख संपत्ति मिला और तन का कष्ट मिटाओ तो भगवान मिल गया. He is saying क्या करना है सबका? जाना ही है. So he's a rebel. He's an actual philosophical rebel, much more than somebody with a guitar or purple hair. And that is what he is to me. That's Viz.
Okay. So who's got the timing? Audience? Yeah? Should we open it? So we can now open it out to the audience for questions. Yeah? Anyone with questions on either of these two heroes who we put up on the calendars?
Anshul, my question to you is, as Isha said, during your young years, you watched the Battle of the Bulge. Battle of the Bulge seems to be, I presume, is the longest war story and the longest war film ever made. Does that resonate in this book, or does Subhash Chandra Bose, as a fighter in Indian politics or during the war or during the entire period, is there a resemblance of the Bulge and him and India? Does that fit in somewhere, the Battle of the Bulge and Subhash Chandra Bose?
See, though the battles I consumed were actual battles, the battles I'm writing about here, I have to imagine them. So they may or may not align, but Subhash would fit into that framework because the Battle of the Bulge, in a sense, is of a country refusing to accept it has lost and hitting out yet again. And it failed, of course, it's a logistical question. But to that degree, even Kohima is a romantic fight, right? It's Japan throwing its last resources, and it lost. But sometimes you remember the battles countries lost more than the battles that they won, because they were so idealistic, aspirational, and almost doomed to fail. In that sense, yes. Much of what he does is in the similar line.
Thank you. I'm waiting to read the book. Thank you. Thank you, Isha. Thank you, Piali.
Anyone else? Anything you'd like to share? Because we have a family member in our presence and also two family members. Yes, that's right.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First, I must congratulate Mr. Anshul Chaturvedi for giving a new insight. Many books have been written on Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, but I think the time has come to really understand the man, that he was just not a freedom fighter. He went much beyond just fighting for his country. And I would love to read your book, but you see, I think we need authors who really need to understand maybe your next book. Well, I am also trying to write a book on the relevance of both brothers in 21st century India, basically Sarat Chandra Bose and Subhash Chandra Bose. It will take some time because the certain documents, because I want to put forward evidence, documentary evidence to what I say. So, you see, what we need to understand, the relevance of Netaji. You see, many fought for freedom, right, way back from 1857 onwards, with the Sepoy uprising of Mangal Pandey. Then we had Bhagat Singh, Khudiram Bose, the revolutionaries who sacrificed their lives. We had Mahatma Gandhi's non-violent movement, also had an impact. There are a lot of people who disagree, but I think Mahatma Gandhi's role was certainly there. But I think what we need to highlight, the first battle was the 1857 Sepoy uprising, which was crushed by the British. But the final onslaught on British imperialism was none other than the Battle of the Indian National Army and subsequent INA trials, which were held in 45 and 46, which completely destroyed the loyalty and allegiance of the British forces. You are fully aware of this. There were 25 lakh British forces. Out of that, only 40,000 were Britishers. The rest were all Bharatiyas. They would have revolted, and they did. 78 ships revolted in Mumbai port. Britain had to leave India. But if you see on a larger scale, it was basically Hitler, Tojo, and the Indian National Army. These three factors was the final straw. But Netaji and 21st century India, definitely he was a devout Hindu. He was a Kali Bhakt. He used to go and pray at Dakshineshwar Mandir. But today we need to understand, Subhash Chandra Bose never mixed up religion with politics. You see, he stood out as a leader for the simple reason he refused to use religious symbols for political purposes. I think this is a message that we must convey to our political fraternity. I'm also part of it right now. But I think we are going, you can't honor Subhash Chandra Bose if you don't follow his principles and ideology. Just garlanding Netaji's statue is of no use. Setting up a museum, you can't keep his gigantic personality within four walls of a museum. You have to follow his inclusive, secular ideology. So this is what I've been conveying to the Honorable Prime Minister also. I don't want to make it political, but I think it's not a political party. I think as a message should go to 135 crore population, that if we want to keep India united, we had partition, that had to happen. But to keep India united, the India that we have, there is no other path but the path that Subhash Chandra Bose took. Inclusive politics, unite all religions. You see, in the Indian National Army, there were 60,000 soldiers. There was not a single Hindu. There was not a single Muslim, Sikh or Buddhist. Then who were these people? They were all Bharatiyas. They ate together, slept together, and fought together. And the other concept, today we are talking about women's emancipation, equal rights to women. In the 40s, there was no other army in the world, in the early 40s, which gave equal status to women. The Rani of Jhansi regiment, as you know, they fought with the men for their country's freedom. So these concepts, he was a man much beyond his times. So we need to understand this, and I'm sure after reading your book, we would be more enlightened. And, this concept of Swami Vivekananda, of course, Swami Vivekananda was a spiritual guru. And without Swamiji, he probably wouldn't have got that mental strength. See, physically, he wasn't very fit. My father, Amyanath Bose, shared the same room with him for almost 6 years in our Woodburn Park house. He was not very fit, but he was mentally extremely strong. So he could, continue the battle for freedom. He had a militarism in him. This I must also say. A lot of people...
Yeah, from the cadet days itself.
Exactly. In 1928, when the Calcutta Congress session was held, Mahatma Gandhi didn't like it. Mahatma Gandhi was also in Calcutta that time. And this is what I've heard from my father, Amyanath Bose. I'll be quick. He was... You see, my great-grandfather, Subhash's father, Janakinath Bose, he was standing on the staircase when Subhash, dressed in his khaki uniform, Yes, GOC, he was commanding this uniform cadet corps. They used to march at the Calcutta Maidan. So when he was coming down the stairs, Janakinath Bose said, Subhash, I think it was rather prophetic. Subhash, I hope you will be the Garibaldi of India. And Subhash proved that he was the Garibaldi of India. I won't take any much more time, but really thank you very much because we need to study this man in a different light. He was a freedom fighter, he fought for the country, many fought for the country. But Subhash had something different, and that difference is what made him Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. Thank you, and sorry for taking so much time.
It was very interesting. In fact, the Jai Hind slogan in your book, it's very interesting how it comes up, because he was...
When he referred to this, as he was talking, I was reminded of this other line, because, again, you would know, when after Deshbandhu was no more, when Gandhiji sort of divided those roles, so he gave Jatindra Mohan Sengupta the presidency to the Swaraj Party, president of the Bengal Congress, and mayor of Kolkata. And then at that time Subhash was in prison in Mandalay. So Sharad asked Gandhiji, what have you left for Subhash? And that's a line I kept fictionally for Subhash to go back and repeat. So Gandhiji told Sharad, justifying giving him no role here, for Subhash there is the whole of India. So whether it was prophetic or it was meant to be tongue-in-cheek, but fictionally speaking, that's what Subhash comes back and meets Gandhi with, that, the whole of India is what then I will have if I'm not to be here. And to that degree, even the alignment with the military space, and that is a very recurrent point, that, from his, what is now called the NCC, from that point of time, he had this fascination with the uniform, but he was not very fit. At the end, he did get his uniform, though.
Right. So he didn't formally come out from any military academy.
That's also part of the dilemma. Because when you deal with professional soldiers and you are not a professional soldier, how do you balance that out? Because the political aim of an army and the military conduct of an army are two different things.
The art of guerrilla warfare in the northeastern states, which he did, and the other contribution of the Indian National Army. You see, there were 60,000 soldiers, 26,000 sacrificed their lives, which is 44%. Nowhere in the world this kind of sacrifice we have seen in world history of war. So these are certain things, which Indian National Army and its leader Netaji stands out. That's the thing.
And so one small point I'll make, that perhaps one of the reasons that you say not to fictionalize something. Now, many years back, I was doing a story for the paper on Gandhi Jayanti. And go around talking and saying, okay, how many people wear Gandhi t-shirts? What sort of t-shirts tend to be taken? Because that whole silhouette sort of tends to work, those spectacles and stuff like that. And then you say, what do you remember the most in the last 5, 6, 8, 10 years? And now in Delhi, of course, you have the whole Gandhi Memorial, XYZ, institutions, statues. And 60% will say Gandhigiri. So Munnabai MBBS tends to tell young people as much about Gandhi as, the more structured reading. And therefore, my takeaway from that thought was that maybe it's not a bad idea sometimes to bring a softer, story-friendly narrative, because otherwise the younger generation, they find the formative structure very intimidating, no matter how good it is, but they don't enter that temple. So, set up a little mail outside the temple to get them to proximity of it. And so that's the effort, in a sense, with both books, that if they read a brighter pop Vivekanand, so to say, which is not so profound and esoteric, but about appraisals and examinations, they may pick up his actual writing and consume it. Similarly, by perhaps reading a non-academic space where the thoughts of Bose keep popping in every now and then, they begin to say, look, maybe I need to read for myself what the man was about.
Very true.
That's the objective, to sneakily take them into philosophy which they didn't plan to go into.
As very textbook knowledge, whatever we studied in history lessons, like I told him, but you must, if you read this book, because of the flow of the narrative, and maybe because of this injection of a bit of fiction towards the end, it sets you thinking also, which is really interesting.
And I think his letters also give us a lot of insight into what kind of a person he was.
And that's true for both.
Yes.
Because
A young man, he has the guts even to stand up to a towering figure like Rabindranath Tagore. You know, that just shows how much of courage he had, not only as a freedom fighter, but even as a person. He's being able to tell Rabindranath that, you know, I would like Romarola to write the preface to my book, but don't write the same kind of letter that you wrote to him earlier, because that way he will never reply. You know, to be able to stand up to someone like Tagore is something fantastic.
Correct.
And one more point that I'd like to make is that, you know, in all our future publications on Netaji, and there's going to be so many more, I think a little more of the contribution of the people of the Northeast should come in. I think that is very neglected, particularly the people of Nagaland, who actually gave him shelter and who provided him with food, not only for him, for his entire army. I think these are things that are totally neglected. And I think that should come in a little more. I think the people of Nagaland also feel very bad about it.
see, there are 20 books waiting to be done
I
on
know.
this if we were to go into his life, which is different from his message.
Yes,
His message becomes political, but like you're saying, what you are saying is a human story.
yes,
Which is beyond the policy. So the problem is we have all got a little stuck, like these common readers have got stuck at the hyphenation of Hitler Bose and then Gandhi Nehru Bose. And there's not much is discussed. I mean, Emily hardly gets mentioned. I mean, if you do a poll in a Delhi or a Bombay, and put a picture and give her name and say, who's Emily Shankly?
nobody will
You don't know.
You know, in every village in Nagaland where he has spent some time, they all the old people there, you know, who have interacted with him as a very, very young child or a young man, they have one story to say, that he was so handsome that the women of the village used to say that it would be such a shame to lose him in war. And it's said in all the villages, so it's not a story that is being made up, because it is being said in all the villages. So, you know, these are certain aspects of his life which are so interesting to know the person, that I don't know why it has never come into any of the writings.
Duly noted from an expert. Now, when there are these few questions, my general experience is either the audience believes in nothing that you have said or everything. I don't know which one it is.
They just consumed everything you said.
No, thank you for that wonderful session. And on behalf of all of us, we just like to request Mr. Chandra Bose to felicitate Mr. Anshul Chaturvedi with a slight memento.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting session.
Do it. You put up something on Twitter 2-3 months back. You put a picture of Netaji and Vivekananda.
Right.
And if India has to move, we have to follow their philosophy. And to that degree, popularizing them or simplifying them, I think is the way to go, because the regular country is already out there.
That's right.
But outside of Bengal, I think we don't really read them enough.
Right.
That's my small attempt to infiltrate minds in a Bangalore or a Chennai or a Hyderabad.
Right.
Say, you know what, this is not a Bengal leader.
Correct.
He's not a political guy. For your good, for the comprehension of your life and national collective.
Correct. We must project them in the social context. You see, unfortunately, it has been politicized. So there are a lot of people who stay aloof. If we put it on the social map, then people would willingly accept it. And that's what I feel,
That will be the effort.
in spite of being in politics.
Chaturvedi and Ms. Isha Datta for the engaging session, and we would also like to show our gratitude towards our sponsor, Shree Cement Limited. We are also grateful and would like to express our thanks to our media partner, My Kolkata, The Telegraph Online, and last but not least, we would also like to show our appreciation towards our patrons, without whom today's session would not have been successful. Thank you everybody once again. Stay well and stay safe. Goodbye for now.